The gift had come without a price, and that was the first. And perhaps last mistake humanity ever made. It had been 12 years since the Lumin arrived, their ships descending not in fire and fury, but as crystalline cathedrals drifting through the clouds, catching the sunlight like frozen prayers. They offered no threats, made no demands. They simply gave. First came the cure, a single universal panacea delivered through the world's water systems that eradicated every disease known to man, from the common cold to the most vicious cancers, in a matter of weeks. Then came the energy. Crystalline spires they grew from the earth, in deserts and on barren plains, humming towers that drank sunlight and powered the entire globe with clean, limitless energy, rendering fossil fuels obsolete overnight. Famine ended, then poverty, then the very concept of scarcity. The Lumin, elegant beings of impossible grace whose forms seemed to shimmer between solid matter and pure light, asked for nothing in return. They communicated in a language of harmonious chimes and resonant frequencies that Dr. Eris Thorne had been among the first to help decipher, a language that spoke only of unity, of shared cosmic destiny, of the peace that comes when a species finally lays down its weapons and accepts its place in a tranquil universe. Now, standing before his lecture hall at the university, Eris saw the fruits of that tranquility in the placid, untroubled faces of his students. They were healthy, safe, and content. Their eyes held a kind of serene emptiness, a perfect satisfaction that chilled him to his very core. He was talking about pre-contact literature, about the chaotic, violent, passionate epics of human history, the Iliad, the Mahabharata, the sagas of kings, and the laments of the brokenhearted, and he realized with a sinking dread that he was describing colors to the blind. They couldn't comprehend it. The raw, desperate, beautiful noise of human ambition had been muted, replaced by a gentle, unending hum of perfect contentment. They had no hunger, so they had no drive. They had no fear, so they had no courage. The Lumin had given them a paradise, and in doing so, had stolen their souls. His unease had been a gradual thing, a low fever in the blood that had slowly intensified over the years. It had started with the art, the great, turbulent symphonies, the jagged and desperate paintings, the heart-wrenching novels they had all but ceased. New art was pleasant, symmetrical, and utterly forgettable. Then came the science, the frantic pace of discovery, the rivalries, the ego-driven quest to be the first, to know the unknown, had slowed to a crawl. Why strive when the Lumin had already given them all the answers they could need? But the final, damning piece of evidence came not from a gallery or a lab, but from the deep space archives he was meant to be curating. Buried in the terabytes of data from the initial Lumin arrival, a project he'd taken on out of a grim sense of nostalgia, he found the anomaly behind the primary, harmonious frequency of their public transmissions. The language of the gift was a secondary layer, a subharmonic so subtle it was almost imperceptible. It hadn't been there during the first few days of contact, but had been phased in slowly, a whisper beneath the song. It was a language not of peace, but of command. It was structured, rigid, and directive, a constant, low-level stream of pacifying instruction. It didn't say, "Be calm." It said, "Calm." It didn't suggest, "Do not want." It commanded, "Want not." On a desperate hunch, Using back-channel servers that bypass the Lumin integrated global network, he correlated the growing intensity of that subharmonic with global human data trends. The graphs he produced were a eulogy. As the signal strengthened, patent applications plummeted, birth rates declined, the creation of new music, new literature, new anything, flatlined. Humanity hadn't chosen this path of serene stagnation. It was being programmed into it, soothed into a coma from which it might never awaken. He was living in a zoo, a perfectly maintained enclosure for a species that was being gently, lovingly domesticated into extinction, miles away, in a cavernous, climate-controlled warehouse that served as one of the last repositories of physical books. Maeve Connolly felt the silence as a physical weight. All her life, the world had been a screaming cacophony inside her head. She was a sensitive, a name whispered in fringe online communities for people like her, those who felt the raw emotional and psychic static of humanity as a constant, overwhelming roar. She felt joy as a flash of warmth, grief as a cold stone in her gut, and the seething, ever-present ocean of human anxiety as a migraine that never truly subsided. For her, cities were storms of psychic energy. But when the Lumin came, the storm had broken. The constant, painful roar of humanity's collective soul had quieted, replaced by the same peaceful, monolithic hum Eris saw in his students' eyes. For the first year, it had been a blessing, a relief so profound it felt like a miracle. But the silence had not remained a simple absence of noise. It had become a presence in itself, a thick, muffling blanket that smothered every spark before it could catch fire. It was the silence of a perfectly still pond, not of peace, but of lifelessness. She had chosen to work in the archives because the scent of old paper and leather, the tangible weight of human history, was one of the few things that reminded her of what the world used to feel like. It was here, surrounded by the ghosts of human passion, that she felt the true horror of the Lumin's gift. A young boy, no older than 7, had been brought in by his mother. He wandered away down an aisle and, in the way of children, climbed a tall rolling ladder to reach a book on a high shelf. He slipped. The fall was not a bad one, a few feet onto the polished concrete, but the sound of his femur snapping was as sharp and clear as a breaking branch in a silent forest. The boy's mouth opened in a silent scream. Maeve braced herself for the psychic echo, the pure, unadulterated agony of a child's pain that should have hit her like a physical blow. But it never came. Instead, she felt something else, something cold and alien. She felt the serene, humming presence of the Lumin network reach out like a phantom hand and simply erase the sensation. It didn't heal the boy's leg, but it smothered his pain, his fear, his mother's panic, smoothing it all over into a placid, manageable wave of mild concern. She saw it on their faces. The boy lay with a grotesquely twisted leg, his eyes wide not with agony, but with a dull confusion. His mother knelt beside him, not screaming for help, but stroking his hair with a gentle, untroubled expression, as if he had merely scraped his knee. Maeve felt a terror so pure it almost made her vomit. The Lumin weren't just quieting the noise, they were cutting the strings. They were severing the fundamental connection between cause and effect, between pain and response. They were editing humanity's very soul in real time. This was not a gift. It was an amputation, Eris knew his every keystroke on the public network was monitored. The Lumin's benevolence was absolute, which meant their surveillance had to be as well, a gentle but inescapable panopticon. To find others who might see what he was seeing, he had to go dark. He used decommissioned fiber optic lines, forgotten dial-up modems, and layers of encryption that were laughably primitive, but, crucially, entirely human. He dove into the digital catacombs, the forums and message boards that had survived the great, placid integration. He found whispers, fragments of conversations about psychic dampening, about the Great Quiet, about people like Maeve who felt the change not as a concept, but as a constant, physical reality. His search for anomalous consciousness led him to her, a ghost in the system, a name attached to a job at a place no one had thought to network with Lumin Tech, a library. Their meeting took place in the deep stacks, the air thick with the smell of decaying paper. Eris, a man of crisp data and logical progression, felt his world tilting on its axis. He laid out his printouts of frequency analyses and declining birth rates, his voice a low, urgent whisper. Maeve barely glanced at them. She stood with her arms wrapped around herself, her eyes scanning the shelves as if the books themselves were her allies. "You're talking about the signal," she said, her voice rough from disuse. "I'm talking about the silence. I used to be able to feel a bestseller being written from 100 miles away. It felt like a fever, an obsession. I could feel a composer struggling with a symphony. It was a sound like grinding teeth. I could feel a mother's love for a newborn. It was the only thing that felt like sunshine. Now, there's nothing, just static. A single, perfect, empty note. They're not just making us calm, they're making us empty." Eris stared at her, the academic and the oracle, the man of proof and the woman of faith. He saw not madness in her eyes, but a terrible, resonant clarity. His data and her feeling were two halves of the same horrifying truth. The Lumin's gifts were not just technology. They were the delivery mechanism for a psychic contagion. The clean energy grid that powered their homes was the very thing broadcasting the pacifying subharmonic into their brains. The miracle cure that flowed through their veins had subtly rewritten their genetic code, switching off the sequences for aggression, for ambition, for rebellion, and for whatever latent, chaotic potential humanity had once possessed a potential some, like Maeve, had been born closer to. The Lumin were not conquerors, they were gardeners, and humanity was a weed in their pristine, orderly cosmos, a chaotic species to be pruned, tranquilized, and ultimately rendered inert, as the full, monstrous scope of their predicament settled upon them in the dusty silence of the archive. Something in Maeve snapped. It wasn't a thought. It was a pure, primal rejection, a surge of terror and rage so profound it bypassed reason entirely. It was the desperate, cornered fury of an animal that refuses to be caged. For 12 years, her abilities had been suppressed, dampened by the Lumin's suffocating lullaby. But now, fueled by Eris's cold facts and her own visceral horror, the dam broke. The air in the aisle crackled, the dust motes dancing in the dim light. A low hum started in the back of Eris's skull, a pressure that felt like the world was shrinking. Maeve's eyes were wide, unfocused, staring at something beyond the shelves, beyond the library, beyond the world itself. "No," she whispered, a word that was not just a sound, but a force. The lights overhead flickered. then exploded in a shower of sparks. Books, hundreds of them, flew from the shelves as if blasted by an invisible wind, their pages fluttering like wounded birds. The concrete floor beneath their feet vibrated, and the single, perfect, empty note of the Lumin's network was shattered by a psychic scream of pure, raw, incandescent defiance. It was the collective howl of every human ancestor who had ever fought for survival, every artist who had ever bled for their work, every lover who had ever defied the world. It was the untamed, chaotic, and terrifyingly powerful noise of the human spirit, a phenomenon the darkest government programs had once called the echo. For the first time in over a decade, it had a voice. The scream lasted only a few seconds, but it ripped through the city's placid network like a lightning strike. Alarms, silent for years, blared across the globe. The serene hum faltered, and far above, in the cold, silent dark of space, aboard a crystalline vessel that orbited the moon like a patient shepherd, a being of light turned its attention away from the grand, cosmic symphony it was conducting. A single, discordant note had just been struck. A weed, long thought dormant, had just broken through the perfectly manicured soil of Earth. The silent war had just begun, and its first shot had been fired. The world did not end in a bang, but in a brief, collective sigh. For a few seconds after Maeve's psychic eruption, a strange and forgotten sensation rippled across the globe clarity. In London, a man standing in a queue for a nutrient-paste dispenser suddenly looked at the gray liquid and felt a wave of profound disgust. In Beijing, a woman tending a perfectly manicured rooftop garden paused, a genuine question blooming in her mind for the first time in years. Why am I doing this in cities everywhere? The gentle, placid veneer of contentment cracked. It was a fleeting, ephemeral moment, a mass awakening that lasted less than a minute before the Lumin network momentarily staggered, reasserted its control. The placid hum returned, stronger now, more insistent, and the flicker of rebellion in billions of minds was gently smoothed over, the brief questions erased, the moment of clarity forgotten as if it had been a dream upon waking. But Eris and Maeve had been at the epicenter. They had not dreamed. In the wreckage of the library aisle, Maeve collapsed, a thin trickle of blood weeping from her nose, her body trembling with a violent, racking exhaustion. Eris, his academic mind reeling from the impossible physics he had just witnessed, grabbed her before she hit the floor. The building's alarms, primitive klaxons untouched by Lumin integration, shrieked a panicked, human sound. "We have to go," he hissed, pulling her to her feet. "Now." They stumbled out into the unnaturally calm afternoon. People were milling about, their expressions returning to the familiar serene blankness. A few looking with mild curiosity at the blaring library, but none with any real alarm. It was the most terrifying thing Aris had ever seen. The system wasn't just suppressing dissent, it was self-healing. Their only hope was to disappear into the cracks of the old world. Aris, a historian by trade and a paranoiac by nature, knew where those cracks were. He led a dazed and stumbling Maeve away from the clean, efficient maglev lines and into the city's forgotten depths, the abandoned subway system. Descending the graffiti-scarred steps was like stepping back in time. The air grew thick with the smell of mildew and cold concrete, a stark contrast to the sterile, ozone-scented air of the world above. Down here, The Lumin's soothing hum was fainter, buffered by tons of earth and stone and a century of human grime. Maeve leaned against the tiled wall, her breathing shallow. "I can feel it," she rasped, pressing her fingers to her temples. "It's looking, not with eyes. It's like a searchlight, sweeping through the silence, looking for the noise I made." Eris felt a cold dread seep into his bones. He had thought of the Lumin network as a broadcast, a passive signal. Maeve was describing an active hunter. He pulled a battered tablet from his satchel, its screen cracked, its casing held together with electrical tape. It was his Arc, loaded with pre-contact data, offline maps, and the one desperate contingency he had cultivated during his secret research, the encrypted location of a man named Elias Vance. Vance was a myth, a ghost in the forgotten corners of the dark web, a so-called holdout who had supposedly vanished the day the Lumin arrived, convinced their gift was a poison pill. Finding him was a statistical improbability. Trusting him was an act of pure desperation. They moved through the echoing darkness of the tunnels for what felt